Our next presenter, Dr. Loxley Monroe, is no stranger to the group. Dr. Loxley Monroe is a proud descendant of Ragged Island, and also, a graduate of the Government High School. He is a graduate of the University of the West Indies, Jamaica, where he obtained his medical degree, and subsequently his postgraduate degree in general surgery, for which he was the first Bahamian to obtain that DM degree in general surgery. Dr. Monroe has had a very long and dedicated career in general surgery and more recently bariatric procedures. He has co-authored papers, made presentations locally as well as internationally, moderated sessions, organized workshops related to laparoscopic surgery. Today, Dr. Monroe will be speaking to us about bariatric surgery and the Bahamian experience. So let us please welcome Dr. Loxley Monroe.
Good afternoon. I truly appreciate this opportunity to make this presentation this evening. And in truth, I see a couple of my old chiefs here. I see Dr. Nuri sitting there. It's a man who taught me a whole lot of neurosurgical procedures. I see Dr. Percival McNeil, Dr. Glenn Benaby. He was in the newspaper in 1978 when I finished my second MB. He just finished his final MBBS. I don't think I have any disclosures. I shouldn't really say that. I'm going to disclose bariatric surgery and the experience I've had with it in this organization. Many of us who trained during the time that I was trained, we spoke about malnutrition. And essentially, malnutrition, we knew about marasmus and kwashiorkor. And again, those were how we define those conditions. Because of starvation and calorie restriction, the European Union introduced something called their agricultural policy, the Common Agricultural Policy, which resulted in what was so-called Butter Mountain and the Milk Lakes. And as far as I know, I was in Jamaica at the time and this thing really took effect, and it truly destroyed the dairy industry in Jamaica, because we used to enjoy Jamaican ice cream and milk. And once they started this Butter Mountain business, the whole dairy industry in Jamaica went down. We started to import stuff into Jamaica. As I have there, technology has improved, farming has improved, transportation, and the method of farming using tractors and so forth. We have genetically modified organisms and lifestyle changes. All of these impact obesity. What lifestyle? Originally, 250,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were hunter-gatherers. This is what we used to do, 4 miles a day. The men went out in the front, they fought, the women and the children followed. But they walked 4 miles every day. Then they had to work when they got home. This is what our lifestyle is like today. We sit down in front of a TV, we smoke, we eat pizza, we have our beer. We don't have to do anything. And we speak about obesity. Our lifestyle have changed significantly from where we evolved from. In some part of the African continent, to be fat means that you are successful. If you are thin, you po, as we say in Jamaica, mega, that means you are not successful. Your life is not what it ought to be. So this whole business of obesity is far more complex than what you may initially believe. It's a result of a combination of different factors. This is basically where I got exposed to obesity and bariatric surgery. In 1998, Prof. Belashev, and some of you, I guess few of you will know who that is. He was a guy from Belgium, and he came out here involved with medical tourism to do gastric lab bans before they were approved by the FDA. We did at least 7 or 8 of those cases, myself, him, and Dr. Diggis in Doctors Hospital. I'm mentioning that because I don't really know the outcome of those cases, because they came down, they had their procedures done, and they went back to the United States. And then in New Orleans in 2002, there was a Sentinel Brain event for me. At that conference, essentially this information was presented. That initially, in 1985, you had a certain percentage of the population who were overweight. And it really started in the South, in Georgia, and I think that's South Carolina. And then it spread up around the Great Lakes, and then went west. And then obesity, and then morbid obesity spread through the United States. And really, the question was asked of us who do minimally invasive surgery, what is it that we can do to help people who are obese? This was 2002 in New Orleans. Of course, the Bahamas has its own set of problems. I think many of us are aware of this. Just recently at MAB conference this year, there was a presentation made concerning obesity in our country. And it showed that physicians may not be obese, but those working, the auxiliary staff, they tend to have a problem with obesity. Of course, as a surgeon, you run into all sorts of things, and this is just one of my patients. This is way back, I think sometime in the late 90s. This man actually had colon cancer. I've heard people speak about weight and cancer. This bit of information actually comes from my patients with breast cancer. And as you can see, the truth is I guess I would not really call them fat. There are some of them who are obese, some who are not. This is about, in total, somewhere around about 500 patients who I've looked at. And this is a kind of reflection that I've found in that group of persons. Again, I think in 2006 I made a presentation about obesity and bariatric surgery. And this was a picture, a grandma who took her child to the doctor. I think this was in St. Lucia. And she was complaining to the doctor that the child looked thin. I guess you can see Grammy and what environment that child is growing up in. And again, these are two of the guys who we do this procedure, Dr. Dilip Dan and Dr. Dawes, Alfred Dawes in Jamaica, and Dilip is from Trinidad. We work together at times. What is obesity? Well, we define it by the body mass index, and as you can see, that is weight in kilograms divided by height in meters squared. And this is an old classification. I've been walking around with it in my pocket now for any number of years. BMI is scientific, measurable, and reproducible. What is the consequences of obesity? Many, many, many. I'm sure we all know about them. Sleep apnea, headaches, hypertension, diabetes, myocardial infarction. It goes on and on. Psychiatric, fertility issues, and so forth. So there is no discipline in medicine, including pediatrics, who are not impacted because of obesity. None. Every specialty. What are the procedures? Again, I grew up in medicine in Jamaica, and according to Bob Marley, in this great future, let us not forget our past. Billroth was an Austrian surgeon who actually performed gastric procedures for peptic ulcer disease. And in my time in the DM program, what we knew is that if you did a partial gastrectomy in a woman, she would lose about 10% of her weight. So we tried to avoid gastrectomy in women in particular. Kremen, he first initiated intestinal bypass in 1954. Scopinaro, he did his biliary pancreatic diversion, and Hess in 94 did the biliary pancreatic diversion with duodenal switch. Where did they get that idea from? Billroth really spoke to the volume in the stomach, and Kremen really noted that after a child had volvulus or necrotizing enterocolitis and you had to do intestinal resection, those children never ever became fat. They were always slim. So he knew that absorptive capacity contributed to your actual body mass index. So the procedures that are available from a surgical point of view are gastric bands, and in today's world they have stopped doing those. The duodenal switch and biliary pancreatic diversion and the sleeve gastrectomy. And these procedures can all be done open or laparoscopically. There are other procedures done by gastroenterologists in particular where they put balloons and balls and various things in the stomach. And in today's world, you can actually do a suture of the stomach endoscopically. So there are a number of different procedures that are available. When I had to choose a procedure after 2002, I preferred the duodenal switch and biliary pancreatic diversion, simply because when you look up in the literature, you will find that most patients can actually beat the sleeve gastrectomy. They can beat the gastric band. They can beat a lot of things. I've had patients who have had their teeth wired down, and they would actually puree macaroni and cheese to have it. I've had patients who would puree cheesecake along with ice cream and drink it. Even after this surgery, I've had patients who have cases of O. Henry at their desk, or they eat milk chocolate endlessly, because the obesity is more than just a matter of what you eat. It is your addressing your stress situation in your life, and there are folks who do it because they are stressed. And again, the first presenter, he spoke about the duodenal switch. This is to give you some idea of the procedure that I would have preferred, which is you're reducing the size of the stomach. You are switching over the duodenum. You're cutting the small bowel in half and switching the duodenum to the distal part of the small bowel. And again, this procedure was relatively simple because I did Whipple's procedure, Longmire's modification, where you preserve the pylorus. So preserving the pylorus was not a problem. Cutting the small bowel in half was not a problem either. And then reconnecting. This is the bariatric sleeve gastrectomy. How do these things work? As I mentioned, reduction in gastric volume, reduction in absorptive length. There's also two hormones you have to be aware of, something called leptin and ghrelin. Leptin is a satiety hormone secreted by adipocytes. Ghrelin is made in the GI tract. They both impact the hypothalamus. Ghrelin actually causes you to eat, and leptin produces satiety. How were these patients chosen? First patient was done in 2009. AMC, 58 years old. She had polio with skeletal abnormalities, joint deformities, back pain, hypertension. She was diabetic. She had a pulmonary embolus. She had an inferior vena cava stent. She had obstructive sleep apnea. And she wanted to know what she could do to improve her lifestyle. Can something be done about my weight? And that was my first response. It took about 7 or 8 weeks to get her done, because every anesthetist refused to put her to sleep. Well, I see him put up a sign, he give me a red flag. The total number of patients so far is 23. 5 were gastric band. There was 1 death. That same lady actually died about 18 months later from another problem. There was 1 particular problem with a retained swab on a fistula. 2 of those patients actually went into chronic renal failure and are now on dialysis. In total, only 2 males were involved, 16 females. The age of these patients were from 26 to 58, average of about 45, middle age. That's just to give you some idea of the patient, that primarily the duodenal switch with pleuropancreatic diversion was the procedure of choice. And after much marketing, the gastric sleeve became more popular. The initial BMI range from 47 to 79 with an average of 61. The current range is 38 to 59, an average of about 48, and the difference is about 12.9. So it's made a difference. That's just a graphic representation of said thing. Weight loss, again, the current weight average is about 274, the average was 359. The duodenal switch procedure was much more effective as a weight loss mechanism as opposed to the sleeve gastrectomy. Again, just a graphic representation of that. As I mentioned, that first patient actually died about 18 months later. We had some complication, surgical, the swab, and the fistula. And of course, we have those 2 with chronic renal failure. They're both diabetics and hypertensive. And again, as I mentioned, some of these patients, they really fight their procedure. We've had any number of resolution of medical problems. What I can say is, despite the small number of cases, it's a worthwhile effort. Look into the future. It requires a team effort, and it ought to be independent of those insurance companies, because none of these procedures were done because I was necessarily paid for them. They were done because patients presented with problems. That's why they were done. Who are the losers? I guess Peloton will be losing. If people lose weight, you don't have to go and buy that thing. Nike, an $80 billion company, maybe they'll be the loser. The pharmaceuticals, they will lose. You don't have to buy any diabetic, any hypertensive medication, no Crestor, et cetera, et cetera. Big business. And who will be the winner? I got permission to put this young lady's picture up here. She's actually one of my patients with breast cancer. She's 20-year survivor. Our patients will be the winner. Thank you very much.
We have a keynote presentation now. Dr. Lawrence Cheskin is an associate professor in health, behavior, and society at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. He also has appointments in medicine, international health, nursing, and public health studies. He directs the Johns Hopkins Weight Management Center. Weight Management Center and treatment program, which he founded. And he also is the director of clinical research in the Global Obesity Prevention Center at Johns Hopkins. So he is involved in many public health and clinical programs to develop innovative treatment and prevention strategies for obesity management. And his concern, as is the theme of this segment, prevention and treatment, that is his concern and his focus. And so at this time, let us welcome Dr. Lawrence Cheskin, who will speak on the complete approach to weight management.
Thank you for that, lovely introduction, and I apologize, it's getting late in the afternoon. You guys must be getting tired. We can't take a break because there's no time, but humor me, because otherwise you will fall asleep while I'm speaking. Everybody stand up, just at their seat.
Hi, Doc, which one is this slide?
So I'll try to run through these quickly, and I'm more than happy to share these slides with anyone if you want to distribute them later. Thank you. So what is a complete approach? A complete approach is something that goes from prevention all the way through to, forgive me, bariatric surgery, because that's the most aggressive form of treatment that we have now. And yet, like many other chronic health conditions that we treat in medicine, there needs to be some sort of staged, stepped approach. So if somebody comes into your office or is seen in the hospital and their blood pressure is high, you don't immediately put them on 3 different antihypertensives and check and see if their renal artery, there's something wrong with it, that it needs to be unclogged. You do a stepwise approach, and the first step is the least risky. You'll just say, less salt in your diet, and let's recheck it again, in a month. And we can make a similar comparison to how you treat obesity. Anyway, let me run through the information. I'm going to skip this stuff because you've seen this already. The prevalence is increasing greatly in the United States and in the Bahamas. What we haven't talked about, though, is that when you get an increase in prevalence, you also get a greater increase in the prevalence of severe obesity, because weight is sort of a bell-shaped curve. We've got very few people who are too skinny and very few people who are extremely heavy, but when you shift the curve to the right, in other words, you make the whole population heavier, then all of a sudden the upper end of the curve is much more common. And then I'd done a study some years ago trying to find people who are underweight to have them gain weight. We couldn't find anybody, unless they already had, dying of AIDS or something, or cancer. Okay. So this is how I can keep you awake. I just keep making noise with the microphone. So that means you have a lot more people who are qualifying for bariatric surgery because of their BMI. Why do we care about this? Is it just, how you're going to look on the beach is going to change if you gain weight? No, it has actual health consequences, and I won't go through this in detail, but the crudest measure is survival, and you forfeit a few years of life if your BMI is in the class 1 obese category, and if you're severely obese, class 3, 8 to 10 years of life. That's a large amount. Cigarette smoking doesn't even do that typically. And if you're both a smoker and obese, you get a double hit. The 8 leading causes of death, this is in the United States, it may be slightly different in the Bahamas, but probably similar, is listed here. And 4 out of the 8 are obesity-related causes, including the top 2, heart disease and cancer. So clearly we're going to do a lot to decrease deaths and prevalence of chronic disease if we were able to address obesity. Perhaps the most dramatic increase in relative risk of disease is seen in type 2 diabetes. And you can see at the right of this graph, if you have a BMI of 35 or higher, which doesn't even qualify you for bariatric surgery at the lower end of that, then you have something like a 70 times increased risk of getting diabetes, which means if you live long enough, you will get diabetes if you're in the severely obese category. This you've already seen. Just about every organ system is affected. Bahamas is ranked 6th most obese country in the world in 2014. The rate is not that much higher than the United States, 36 versus 34%, but it's enough to really jump the country up in its rank. And this is a rank you want to be at the bottom of the pile, not the top of the pile. The causes vary from genetics that we can't do anything about, even though we're learning more and more about them. We can't alter them, to medical causes. Occasionally, it is a new hypothyroid condition that we can treat. Diet, physical activity, behavior, and in many ways, most importantly, our genetics, our environment. Our genetics has not changed, our environment is what has changed. So the social and structural aspects of the problem are really what for public health and population interventions need to be changed. But for treatment, that's also off the table. We can't change the social structure of the United States or the Bahamas just by declaring a change. There are medical causes of obesity. They are relatively uncommon. One study said it probably accounts for 1% of the increase in rates of obesity. The most common thing I typically will see, I'll always check a TSH if they haven't had one done lately to make sure they're not hypothyroid. I'll also do a resting metabolic rate by a test called indirect calorimetry, which measures your breath carbon dioxide production, which is the measure of how much you're burning in the way of fuel, and we compare that to what it should be for your size to see if there's any inadequacy in your metabolism. I won't go through this whole list, but there are some rare endocrine conditions. For children, it's usually easier to pick up these rare endocrine conditions because they're usually short and obese. So that's the trigger. If there's something neuroendocrine going on or genetic going on, they're short or mentally impaired and obese, as opposed, if you have a tall, obese child, forget it. There's nothing medical going on or genetic going on. And even genetics, I will often remark to people who come in and say, it's in my family. Everybody is obese in my family. And I may ask them, is the dog also obese? And usually the dog is also obese, which makes me wonder, is it truly genetic, or is it that everybody is doing the same thing, which is, not being physically active and eating in a certain way, and the dog gets the leftovers. Anyway, medicines, I think someone mentioned, it is remarkable how many people we give medicines to because they're obese and they've gotten type 2 diabetes or high blood pressure or high cholesterol, and those medicines contribute to the problem or they make it worse. And the classic example of this is from 50 years ago, when we found people who were new diabetics and we put them on insulin, which was the only treatment for diabetes 50 years ago. They would gain weight and become obese because insulin is a stimulant to appetite. You feel better, you're no longer wasting sugar in your urine, and you suddenly gain weight. Anyway, this is I wrote a review on this many years ago. This is an underappreciated cause of weight gain. You have to talk to the patients when they're on medicines and ask them, do any of your medicines seem to increase your appetite? The general categories of things to watch out for are hormonal type agents, steroids in particular. I've had patients who say they gained 100 pounds on prednisone, this sort of thing, over time, not over a week. So a quick course of steroids, not to worry, but chronic steroids is another problem. Birth control pills are no longer a problem because they're using smaller and smaller doses of hormonal agents. Hormone replacement therapy may be a little contributor, or is it just menopause as a time for gaining weight often. The older antidepressants, not the newer ones generally, centrally acting drugs for schizophrenia, for manic depressive disorder, and as I mentioned, even some things for hypertension and cholesterol. The sulfonylureas we're using less and less, but they were a big problem. Beta blockers, I never like it when I see a patient on beta blockers for their blood pressure. If it's for their blood pressure and I say there's 20 other drugs, can we put you on something else? Taper it. Anyway. This is, I think, instructive because the general perception is to get to the category of you need bariatric surgery, you must be eating like, an animal forever and, being completely sedentary. Not the case. You can become qualified for bariatric surgery in the following way. The average, at least Framingham, Massachusetts American adult eats about 1 million calories a year. It's probably similar in the Bahamas. The average adult in Framingham, because they've followed them up for 50 years now, gains 0.5 pound a year from age 30 to age 50. So they gain 10 pounds from age 30 to age 50, the average Framingham adult. So to gain the average amount, how far off do you have to be in your 1 million calories a year? Well, 0.5 pound is 1,750 calories. There's 3,500 calories in a pound of body fat. Good number to remember. So the energy balance error is 0.17%. That's like eating a crumb too much at lunch. Doing it consistently, you will gain 10 pounds over 20 years. But the even scarier thing is that if you're off by more than that, let's say you're off by 1.7%, instead of 0.17%, what's that, an extra half of a bite of the sandwich? Then instead of gaining 10 pounds over the 20 years, you would gain 100 pounds over the 20 years and be qualified for bariatric surgery. So an error of 1.7%, eating 1.7% too much. Instead of 2,000 calories, you're eating 2,050 calories, whatever the 1.7% would be, and you become morbidly obese. What drives food choice, though, is a big part of the problem. When they do consumer surveys, the food companies, taste, cost, and convenience is what drives us. So it's got to taste good. It doesn't matter how healthy it is or good for you. If you're trying to feed people food they don't like, forget it. It's not going to work. Cost is important. You can say, yes, fresh raspberries are an excellent thing to eat. They have a lot of fiber and not that many calories. And the cost is, $5 per quarter pint. Then you're not going to get anywhere with that advice. Convenience, if you have to spend 2 hours in the kitchen preparing it, then nobody's going to do it, unless they really like to cook. All of these factors are ones that push us in the direction of getting foods that are going to make us gain weight and not control our weight. Fast food restaurants are more and more common. This is in the United States, but it looks to me like the same thing is happening in the Bahamas. You don't have to go that many blocks to get to a fast food restaurant in downtown Nassau. Portion sizes are also a problem. They've been growing since the 1970s. They're now 2 to 8 times the standard serving sizes that the US FDA puts on the side of those food label packages. And why does this matter? Because what you put in front of people determines to a great extent what they eat. Those sandwiches that we got for lunch, if they had been 50% larger, most of us would have still eaten the sandwich and gotten 50% more calories. Or if there was more mayonnaise, on some of them, as opposed to the little smear of mayonnaise that you got, we're not going to wipe off the mayonnaise on the napkin. We're going to eat it. So what is there? And they've done studies in laboratories, children as well as adults. You double the portion size, they eat 25 or 15% more for children and adults, and they don't make up for it later in the day. So if we were perfect eating machines where our bodies are going to balance our intake, then you eat too much for lunch, for dinner you're less hungry, you make up for it. No, you don't. You partially make up for it. And it depends on the demographics of the person. A young male will pretty much make up for it. It's very hard to get a young male to eat too many calories. They just burn more calories and they seem to compensate. A middle-aged woman, on the other hand, you eat too much for lunch, you're not going to eat very much less for dinner, and you will hold on to those calories. This is also not often discussed, so I'll briefly mention what we call the hierarchy of satiety. The top of the list are the things that are more satiating, more filling per calorie. So there's this concept called energy density. Energy density ranges from 0, which is water. No matter how much you drink of water, you get 0 calories, to fat, which is the most energy dense, which is 9 calories per gram. It's on the food packages, sometimes they say that. So a little lump of cheese with a toothpick in it that's 1 inch square, that you can pop a dozen of them in your mouth, you just had 1,200 calories. 1,200 calories of salad, say without dressing, you couldn't physically eat it, you'd explode. So it's much more filling to have a given amount of calories lower on this list. I'm sorry, higher on this list. 1,200 calories of chicken would be, 5 chicken breasts or something. You would never do that. Protein, most complex carbohydrates next. Carbohydrates have a terrible reputation lately, but especially if they are high fiber type of grains and such, they are almost as filling as protein. Simple carbohydrates are not as filling, and fat is the least filling. Ethanol is even less filling in some ways because it is not sensed that well by the body, and it has almost as many calories per gram as fat. And ethanol also relaxes us and makes us not care about what we're eating. So you have a couple of glasses of whatever with your dinner, and you say, sure, I'll have dessert, because you're no longer concerned about the calories. So a little bit more about dietary fat, because fat has suddenly become popular again. There was a time where we said, you have to avoid fat. It's high in calories, it's bad for your heart, et cetera, et cetera. And then came the Atkins craze, and fat was your friend. You can eat all the fat you want and lose weight on the Atkins diet. And in fact, you did lose weight, but it was water weight initially, and you probably couldn't eat all the fat you wanted because there's just so many, pork chops you're going to eat before you say enough of this. So it turns out that when you compare countries in the world, the heaviest populations have the highest percentage of fat in the diet, not the highest percentage of carbohydrates in the diet. It's very calorically dense. As I said, the little cube is 100 calories. Very palatable. We're used to that taste now. It's not a prehistoric taste. We didn't eat a lot of fat, 10,000 years ago, but we've gotten used to it. It's quick energy. It's a lot of energy. So our bodies are designed to take in as much energy as quickly as possible, because throughout our history and living things in general, the great danger was starvation, not getting too many calories. It's very efficient to store fat, and you have unlimited storage. If you eat too much sugar, yes, your blood sugar will spike, but it will get converted to fat. You don't store it as sugar. There's 10 minutes worth of sugar in your bloodstream, at most a day's worth of glycogen in your liver and muscles, but the only thing you can depend on forever is your fat stores. Anyway, so I would make the case that fat is still the enemy. Yes, not too much white starches and such, because they make your blood sugar spike. They're bad for developing diabetes, etc. But they are less of a problem for causing obesity than fat is. Whoops. I kept pushing it because it wasn't moving. Let me see. And of course, people who are obese like fattier and sweeter foods more than thin people, so this pushes them in the wrong direction, and you get this passive overconsumption of calories. Do what? Oh, in the mic. Okay. Sorry. All right. What about the pattern of eating? This has recently become very popular. There's even people who say every other day you should diet, alternate day feeding. And it turns out that the more obese the individual, the fewer meals they tend to eat per day on average. So skinny people are the ones nibbling, and more heavy people are the ones who, and maybe they're trying to avoid eating too much, so they don't eat breakfast, or they eat hardly any breakfast and very little for lunch, and then they're starving by the time dinner comes, and they eat a fair amount for dinner, and they keep eating after that. That's not a good pattern. Both physiologically, it's not a good pattern. It raises your blood sugar and cholesterol, etc., and it seems to be associated with weight gain and obesity. There is laboratory evidence also. If you feed school children just 3 times a day, 3 square meals, they tend to gain more weight than if you feed them 5 to 7 times a day, as long as they can pick how much they're eating and their choices are not, like in the tuck shops, a lot of very high calorie things. The other side of the energy balance equation we haven't really talked about much at all so far in this meeting, but it is very important. It is not probably as important for losing weight for treatment. If you think you're going to lose 100 pounds by starting to go to the gym, forget it. It doesn't happen except on the Biggest Loser, and that only temporarily. Because what happens when you increase physical activity, which is good for you, I'm not discouraging any of my patients from being physically active, but it makes you hungrier. You go to the gym, and for some reason, most gyms seem to have snack bars in them. I think they have found a better way than the monthly fees to make money, because everyone finishes working out and they're starving. But physical activity is clearly relevant to how much you weigh, because if you look at physical activity versus BMI, the most physically active people are the skinniest. We don't know what it was like many years ago, how much physical activity there was 100 years ago, but I'm pretty sure it was a lot more than we get now. And this is something that is definitely pushing us in the wrong direction. And it's true across the demographic spectrum, men and women, black, white, Latino, everyone. There's a correlation between how much physical activity you do, or even report that you do, and what your BMI is. So you can't lose a ton of weight by being more physically active, but it's always good to encourage, because it's good for making you healthier, even if you don't lose any weight from doing it. And it does seem to be very valuable for maintenance of weight, because you basically have a bigger budget of calories then. You're burning more energy. You can get away with eating more. Moderate intensity exercise burns a greater fraction of fat than high intensity, where you're getting into lactic acidosis and burning carbohydrates mostly, but high intensity exercisers tend to be the skinniest. Both aerobic and strength training types of exercises are helpful in weight control. The aerobic burns much more calories, running, bicycling, swimming, that sort of thing. But the resistance training, the strength training, will build muscle, and for you ladies, make the body composition a little bit more like the male body composition, which is why sometimes it's easier for men to lose weight. They have more muscle, they burn more calories. So on a given level of dieting, they're going to lose weight faster. Short bouts of exercise are just as effective for burning calories as a long one. You don't need to go to the gym for an hour if you just start making sure you're walking a lot during the day. Those step counters some people find useful, and that's been shown in a variety of studies. But I will repeat that exercise is inefficient. And an example is running a marathon, which I cannot do. How many of you have run a full marathon in this room? One. All right. I'm impressed. So even running that full marathon that you ran, the average person will burn the equivalent of 2/3 of a pound of body fat. And people who run marathons will tell you that they are absolutely starving after their marathon. Not immediately, they're collapsing right after their marathon, but some hours later they are starving, and they tend to regain those 2/3 of a pound of body fat by the next day. So if even running a marathon does not cause lasting weight loss, then us, taking a few extra steps is certainly not going to do it, but still good for you. Great. All right. We have to broaden our definition of exercise. It's not just going to the gym, just walking more, taking the stairs instead of an elevator, et cetera, et cetera. It takes a lot of exercise, though, to control weight if you're just going to rely on that, so I would not recommend it. This is a big factor now that is often not discussed, but it is the behavioral use of food. So we eat because it's there, we eat because we're stressed, we eat because we're bored, we eat because somebody else is eating, why can't I have some too, et cetera, et cetera. If you eat alone, you will tend to eat an average of 40% fewer calories than if you eat with a bunch of friends or family. And it's because we're egging each other on, we're saying, why are you not eating, I made it just for you, or, you're making me look bad by not eating as much as I am, whatever is going on. Food is also love. If you love someone, are you going to take them to the gym, or are you going to take them to a restaurant? You probably should take them to the gym because they'll live longer, but our society favors the restaurant. And food as a mountain means we ate it because it was there. Sir Edmund Hillary, when he climbed Mount Everest, was asked why he did this and almost killed himself and a few Sherpas in the process. And he said, I climbed it because it was there, which was a very British response. But that's often why we eat, because it's there. Like my example of the sandwiches, if they were 50% larger, we wouldn't eat 2/3 of them and leave the rest over. We can learn from people who are good weight losers and weight maintainers, and there aren't that many of these people, but there's a registry in the United States called the National Weight Control Registry that has a couple thousand people in it who've lost at least 50 pounds and kept it off for a number of years, and 91% of them are regular exercisers. So here's where, for maintenance, it's useful. Most eat a low-fat but high-carbohydrate diet, and I'm not saying high carbohydrate as in lots of French fries. I'm saying high carbohydrate as lots of vegetables and fruit and whole grains. Most weigh themselves every day, not to make people too paranoid, because there are fluctuations in a day that you don't want to rely on too much. But if you never weigh yourself, you will not realize that you're gaining weight. And most monitor their food intake. Someone who's good at maintaining their weight will be able to tell you, I'm ahead or I'm behind at this point in the day of how many calories I need to eat. And they don't skip meals. All right, treatment. Diet alone. Most people regain weight from diets alone. If you add behavior modification and exercise, you do somewhat better, but the results are not great. The results are not great, and we need to keep working on getting better and better treatments. I'll show you some examples. Are all diets alike, though? There are studies that show that it doesn't matter so much what the kind of diet is. The diets vary mostly by diet composition, from A to Z, from Atkins to the Zone diet, the percentage of calories from carbohydrate, but basically it's more how well you stick to the diet than what the diet is that determines the outcome. Learn to read those food labels. Portion sizes are very misleading. It will often say on a bottle of something, 100 calories per serving, and you say, hey, that's not bad, look at this big bottle. But there's, 2.5 servings in the bottle, so it's actually 250 calories, not 100 calories, etc. What about medications for appetite control? These do help. They're not a first-line treatment. It's like with high blood pressure, you don't start off with medications, but if things are not going well, then you can add a medicine. It's a tool, just as bariatric surgery is a tool. Phentermine is the oldest one. It's been around for 52 years now. 8.1% average mean weight loss, 17 pounds more than placebo in the studies that were done. Orlistat, which is a fat blocker, Xenical is the over-the-counter version, 3.4%. That doesn't really control appetite, it just blocks fat absorption. Qsymia is a combination of phentermine and the anti-migraine medicine and has an additive effect with the two medicines, so it causes 10% weight loss. Belviq is less effective, and fewer than 3% of obese people use appetite suppressant medicines. And with most treatments, what you get is an initial good weight loss. The more aggressive the treatment, the more aggressive the weight loss, and then slowly it starts coming back on over the succeeding years. And that's probably largely due to our environment and our not really wanting to permanently change our habits. Medicines are tried, only for a brief time. If they don't cause weight loss quickly, then they're not going to work. No sense continuing them. Engagement predicts weight loss very strongly. When people are engaged, if they're interested, then they will do better than when they're not engaged. How you frame it to patients is very important. If you scold them and say, you're bad, you're going to die of heart disease, then they will run from you. If you make it a joint enterprise, and as someone said earlier, you also say, I too struggle with this, that's okay. That's a good thing that you connect with the person, then that is very useful. Bariatric surgery has been well covered already, so I'll not go into it in any detail. So is obesity treatable? Well, that same equation I showed you before, it works in the other direction too. If you just cut your intake by a very small fraction over a period of time, you will control your weight and you will lose. The trouble is most human beings are impatient and they want immediate results. So we do aggressive dieting, and that does work, but you have to be aware of all the ins and outs of how you do it and how you keep your habits changed over time. The program I run, the Johns Hopkins Weight Management Center, includes, and this is a multimodal treatment, and I think this works the best, that it's not just a physician, but an exercise specialist, a behaviorist, and a dietitian working together in a team program. And we do give particular foods to people, meal replacements sometimes even, so like the old SlimFast, OptiFast types of things, just to get them started, but they can lose weight just fine on regular foods, and we have a long-term maintenance plan. And we do that body composition testing I mentioned, so we can track their metabolic rate over time. The data that we've had in results, the average, and this was just a chart review of 85 participants, the average weight loss was 38 pounds, and it ranged from 2 pounds to 232 pounds weight loss. So you can lose as much weight as bariatric surgery with a medically based plan. It's just a matter of it happens more reliably with surgery because it partially takes it out of the realm of patient, engagement. Average rate of weight loss was 2 pounds a week. The majority of patients had some health problem, and it's not just that you improve these things. You can get off medications, and people on medications for even diabetes with insulin, you can stop insulin. I've published some papers on this that I'm happy to share. It only took an average of an 11% weight loss, so a 200-pound person losing 22 pounds or 24 pounds to get off of insulin entirely. So you can see people on CPAP masks for sleep apnea, off the mask, etc. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Do we have any questions?
It was a great talk. I was trying to get your book called Weight Loss Good for Life, whatever you did. Is it your book? Weight Loss for Life. I think for life, for good. For good. That was your book.
That's a dirty word.
Oh.
As we were talking before with bariatric surgery, even bariatric surgery is not always for good.
Yeah.
It's much more commonly for good, but if you have someone who is not committed to making changes, then it will never last, which is why we have this yo-yoing of people gaining weight, losing weight, gaining weight, losing weight. So this is more that you get to learn what is driving the person, what is motivating them. It's not always going to be health that is motivating them. It's appearance. It is, I'm going to a wedding and I want to look good. There's all sorts of reasons that people have, and we need to work with these reasons and keep emphasizing long-term outcomes. But there's no easy answer, or we'd have the problem fixed, or I'd have a Nobel Prize if I could fix the problem.
I was using about half the principle of what you just said way back in 1976. Some of the older physicians would know I started a diet clinic. It was supposed to be a metabolic clinic because I was brought here by Dr. Bethel, but he didn't warn me that I would be seeing loads of diabetics and hypertensive in my first month here than I was seeing in 6 months in London. So I started what we call so-called metabolic clinic, trying to lower their hypertensive drug. In those days, those hypertensive drugs were not like now. And the diabetic drugs were like chlorpropamide, and which caused quite a lot of problem. So we started that clinic, and they said, how do I do it? So I said, well, the only book that was out in those days was Aitken's Diet, I think, in the 70s. And then 80s came the others, Pritkin, Scarsdale, Dino Ornish, and so on. So I made instead of making a book, I just said, it's no use of giving a book, just make a one-page, a yes and a no. In the no is definitely sugar was on top of it, all the cookies and so on. And then I use your same principle. If you have to walk a mile to lose 100 calories, am I right? It's about a mile, 100 calories. So if you play tennis for about 2 hours or 3 hours, and then you feel thirsty, you can have a couple of pints of beer, you've lost a whole lot anyway. So those were the type of things I was saying. And of course, I didn't realize there was those ladies outside in a van selling fried chicken and macaroni cheese and potato salad. And this was the lunch of, I'm afraid to say, most of our nurses as well.
All true, thank you.
So we had to cut, so I had to tell them to cut down the fat using a modified Aitken's diet. So that was in '66, and we had about 2,000 patients. By 1988, I had about 6,000. And then I stopped because there was enough books out.
Yep.
There was Aitken's, and there was South Beach Diet, and so on.
Yes,
So
thank you.
thank you very much for what you said.
There might be some other questions. And
Okay, last night the nutritionist told us the environment needs to be altered to lower the gradient. I have to lift my hat to Dr. Monroe. As a surgeon, he reminded us that there is a psychological component to it. And immediately I realized we made a mistake with our planning of the conference because we didn't invite one such person here. And then you brought it up again. What are the most important psychological things to be really addressing? Because it reminds me of addiction.
no, that's very important. Thank you for asking that. And I didn't have time to go into it in depth, but in some ways I feel like I'm no longer a physician, I'm a psychologist, because so much of this is behavioral. And that list I showed you of why do I eat, let me count the ways, when you can address that well and give people different strategies for dealing with their lives, then that can be very, very helpful. So you're eating because you're stressed. I will try to convince people, does eating too much help your stress? And the trouble is, it does for a moment. While you're eating, you're distracted, and it tastes good. It's like, you know, all sorts of bad habits we have. For the moment, it's good. But then later on, you're facing health problems, or you're a heroin addict, or whatever you've done for the moment that felt good at the moment. And food is in many ways addicting, and yet it doesn't help the stress. And so you have to help them deal with stress. Anyway, that's just a brief answer to a very good, complicated question. How often? Oh. It's very helpful for sleep apnea, but people, you know, it's a quality of life issue. It's like, you know, injecting yourself with insulin 3 times a day. Most people would like to get off of it. And they're also 10% weight loss is usually enough to get people off a CPAP machine. The pulmonary doctors don't like to do it. They will make you do, you know, 3 different sleep studies to make sure your sleep apnea is minimal at that point, but often people can get off CPAP.
Is it the last question? My question is, what is your comment on the importance of sleep as it affects weight loss? And I want to be clear, I realize the importance of weight and how it affects sleep, but let's switch it. What do you think, how do you think sleep affects weight loss? Thank you.
It's also a very interesting and current question, because there has only in the last few years, been a lot of interest in that question. So the underlying assumption is, for some reason, when we do studies, we find that people who don't get enough sleep are heavier. And is this because they're not getting enough sleep? Is it because it changes some, you know, neurochemicals? This is still being actively investigated. The most obvious explanation is if you don't get enough sleep, you have more time to eat. And you're up late at night and watching television and nibbling. But it's not clear that that's the whole story. There may be something neurochemical going on, but I'm not convinced that it's as important a factor as some people are proposing. It may be it reduces, you get better sleep, you're less stressed, and you're less likely to, you know, I would prefer that it be some behavioral explanation, that there's something that we can treat with a drug or a neurochemical change.
And this is our final presentation for this session. Our next presenter, Dr. Celine Heskey, is an associate professor of nutrition and program director of the MPH nutrition programs in the School of Public Health at Loma Linda University in Loma Linda, California. She completed both her undergrad and graduate programs in dietetics and human nutrition from Andrews University, and completed her doctoral studies in nutrition at Loma Linda University. Her recent and current research activities evolve around the effects of various nutrients and foods on adiposity and cardiometabolic health. And today she is going to be speaking to us on the contribution of plant-based dietary patterns to health and disease. So please let us welcome Celine Heskey.
Hi, good afternoon. So I'm going to be talking about the contribution of plant-based dietary patterns to health and disease. And there were a few comments today. I noticed someone mentioned that they had tried a vegetarian diet previously and they had to quit because it was too expensive. I would just like to say that one of the reasons why I changed the title of this to plant-based diet is that I'm encouraging individuals to consume more plant-based whole foods, and they don't necessarily have to convert wholly to a vegetarian diet, especially if it's difficult for them. So in terms of disclosures, just want to mention that I do get research support from the Hass Avocado Board. And this will be displayed at the end, so I will skip it for now. The objectives for this session are hopefully that you'll understand the nutritional adequacy of vegetarian diets and behaviors or choices related to risk of inadequacy, that you'd understand the role of plant-based diets in chronic disease prevention, and we'll examine the current research evaluating the relationship between plant-based diets and cardiometabolic risk factors and outcomes, and examine the mechanisms that may explain the benefits of plant-based diets. So earlier today, if you were here, I talked a bit about the definition of different dietary patterns in terms of vegetarian diets. These are the definitions that are used by the Adventist Health Study, which is housed at Loma Linda University. And just to reiterate, semi-vegetarians eat fish but no meat or poultry. Semi-vegetarians eat a smaller amount of meat and fish and poultry than non-vegetarians. Pesco-vegetarians will have fish, but no red meat or poultry. Lacto-ovo-vegetarians may have eggs and or milk, and vegans do not have any animal food products in their diet. So one of the first things that people often ask is whether or not a plant-based diet or vegetarian diet is adequate for providing all of your nutrient needs. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics has published a position paper about this. This paper is free online if you Google it, if you'd like to read more. But some of the statements include that a well-planned vegetarian diet containing vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds can provide adequate nutrition. The adoption of a vegetarian diet may cause a reduced intake of certain nutrients. However, deficiencies can be readily avoided by appropriate planning. That's what's really important. And in the 2015-2020 Dietary Guidelines for Americans, vegetarian diets are recommended as one of 3 helpful dietary patterns. So I'll just review the nutrients of concern that usually people have questions about. One is protein, and vegetarians do eat less protein in general than non-vegetarians. However, they can get adequate protein in their diet from various foods, including cheese, milk, and eggs for lacto-ovo-vegetarians, and soy, legumes, and nuts for those who are vegans. Vitamin B12 is another nutrient of concern since it is only found in foods of animal origin. However, there are fortified foods and supplements that individuals can consume to make sure that they're getting enough vitamin B12. And I would say in general, vitamin B12 is an issue for most older individuals, whether or not they're vegetarians. Iron can be another issue, and vegetarians do consume less iron. In addition to that, plant-based sources of iron are non-heme iron, which are not absorbed as easily. Vitamin C can help with increasing the absorption of non-heme iron. And in addition to that, there are physiological changes in the body that increase the absorption of iron from foods in individuals who have low iron stores. Zinc is another nutrient that tends to be consumed in smaller amounts in vegetarians. However, there are various food items that they can consume that contain zinc, including yogurt, milk, legumes, nuts, and so on. And also, there is an increased absorption rate in individuals who are consuming lower amounts of zinc. Vitamin D, technically, this is an issue for a lot of individuals, especially if they live in a temperate climate or they're avoiding sunlight in order to reduce the risk of skin cancer. But there are various foods, including fortified foods, eggs, and UV-treated mushrooms that can provide vitamin D in the diet. And finally, omega-3 fatty acids, which are known to be beneficial for cardiometabolic health. This particular, the very long chain ones, the EPA and DHA, are not in the diets of vegetarians, partly because the main sources of those are fish. So there are supplements that these individuals can take in order to meet those needs. In addition to that, ALA comes from plant-based sources, and this is a not as long-chain fatty acid, but it's omega-3 fatty acid. If people do consume ALA in substantial amounts, it is possible that some of that will be converted into the very long-chain fatty acids. And the foods that contain ALA include walnuts and seeds like flax seeds, chia seeds, and so on. So it's interesting when people will try to argue that vegetarian or vegan diets cannot provide enough nutrients, but I think these people are some of the really good examples of the fact that vegetarian diets or vegan diets can provide all that you need. On the left-hand side of the screen, this is a vegan bodybuilder. She's been vegan since birth. I will say she's really short. She's about 5'1", so she's not a very big person. And then the guy on the right, who is a German strongman competitor, is a vegan athlete. And these individuals are able to build muscle, and have strength to actively compete in their sports. And these are just a few examples that exist. So there are certain behaviors that may increase the risk of deficiency or excess, and this is important to know, especially if you're interacting with individuals who are trying to become vegetarian but probably not making the best choices. So some of these issues have to do with extreme diets. There are some individuals who follow vegetarian or vegan diets, but they avoid certain food groups, for example, fruitarians. There's some who will insist on not using any fortified foods. It is true that some of those fortified foods are processed food items, but there are some fortified foods that are not processed and are appropriate in the diet. And some of them refuse to use any type of supplement. And depending on whether or not they're at risk for deficiency, it's important for them to understand the appropriate use of supplements. Then again, you have some individuals who may eat certain unhealthy foods in excess. So I call these people French fry vegetarians. They don't have to, potato is a vegetable, but in its fried form, it's not necessarily the best if you're consuming that all the time. There's some individuals who they don't follow a vegetarian diet for health reasons, so they don't necessarily choose a lot of nutrient-dense foods or whole foods in their diet. So what are the recommendations to avoid deficiency for individuals who follow plant-based diets? One is to have adequate calorie intake. Another is to make sure the diet is balanced and they're including all the different food groups that are important. That they're making whole food choices. These are nutrient-dense foods like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and so on. And as needed, that they consult with a qualified individual, registered dietitian nutritionist in the US, and I know there are some RDs in the Caribbean, in order to come up with an appropriate meal plan to make sure that they're meeting all the nutrient requirements. So what is the role of a plant-based diet in terms of disease prevention? And in this particular case, I'm going to be focusing on the major chronic diseases and risk factors that are current in the Western world. So when we think about all the different professional organizations and experts that are making recommendations for reducing the risk of disease, we start to see that there's a similarity between what they're recommending in terms of reducing the risk of heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and so on. And when you look at a summary of all these recommendations together, what you see that they're saying is that individuals should make sure that their intake of calories is balanced with expenditure, and some people may need to reduce their calorie intake as needed. As you get older, especially if you're not physically active, you definitely need to be reducing your calorie intake. In addition to that, they recommend the intake of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, fiber, and healthy fats, including the omega-3 fatty acids, nuts, which also contain healthy fats, and also an anti-inflammatory diet. And in some cases, either overtly or when you look at the recommendations, a plant-based pattern is what's being recommended. So when we look at the 2015-2020 dietary guidelines for Americans, this is actually really incredible that they were able to do this, considering the political implications. But a healthy vegetarian dietary pattern was included as one of the options that individuals could follow in order to reduce the risk of chronic diseases. And as you can see, they encourage the intake of vegetables, and particularly dark green, colorful vegetables and legumes, fruits, whole grains, dairy. Dairy substitutes are appropriate. It doesn't have to be milk or yogurt. protein, including legumes, soy milk, nuts, and seeds, and plant-based oils. So as I said earlier today, the Adventist Health Study is one of those cohorts that includes a substantial proportion of vegetarians. And so they've done several research studies looking at the risk for certain diseases related to dietary patterns. And what you'll see here that among men in this cohort, vegan men had a 28% reduction of risk from disease of other causes other than cardiovascular disease and cancer. There was a 55% reduction in risk of ischemic heart disease and a 42% reduction of risk from coronary heart disease. And sorry to correct that first one, that's supposed to be a 28% reduction of risk from all causes of death. And then among lacto-ovo-vegetarian men, they had a 23% reduction of risk of death from coronary artery disease. And among the pesco-vegetarian men, they had a 27% reduction in risk of all causes of death, a 34% reduction in risk of death from cardiovascular disease, which is not surprising since fish fatty fish has omega-3 fat, which is associated with a decreased risk for heart disease, and a 40% decreased risk from other causes of death besides cardiovascular disease and diabetes. When we looked at women in the cohorts, we are not seeing really good findings at this moment in time. I will say that the length of follow-up at this point is not very long, it's less than 10 years. But we do see that among pesco-vegetarian women, there was a 49% decreased risk of death from ischemic heart disease. And most likely that's related to the benefits of fish related to reducing the risk of heart disease. And then when we look at some of the other causes of death, we see that vegetarian men had a 58% reduction of risk of death from renal disease and a 52% reduction in risk of death from diabetes. But these results didn't translate to women in this particular case. In the Adventist Health Study cohort, they had a sub-study, a subsample that they looked at their various biochemical and anthropometric outcome indicators in order to measure metabolic syndrome. And what they found is that the vegetarians had much lower odds, less than 50% lower odds for having metabolic syndrome when compared to non-vegetarians. And then when we take a look at these some of the components of metabolic syndrome, we see that the vegetarians had significantly lower triglycerides, fasting glucose, blood pressure, waist circumference, and body mass index. Looking specifically at findings in overweight and obesity, within the Adventist Health Study 2 cohort, we find that there's a significant difference in BMI across dietary patterns, with vegans having the lowest BMI and non-vegetarians having the highest BMI. And when we take a look at some of the other studies that have been done in cohorts, including vegetarians, we see here in the EPIC-Oxford study that over time, women in that particular study, among vegans, they gained the least amount of weight. This was not significant for men. But what they found with women is that vegans and pesco-vegetarians gained about 1.12 kilograms per meter squared of BMI per year, whereas the vegetarians and non-vegetarians were about the same. But overall, the difference was significant across dietary patterns. In this study that was done in Taiwan, this is a cohort study where they looked at different cardiometabolic outcomes. We see that the odds for having a large waist circumference, which is basically abdominal obesity, was significantly lower in vegans, lacto-vegetarians, and lacto-ovo-vegetarians. And similarly, BMI was also, having a high BMI was also less likely to occur among the vegetarians and the vegans. This is actually a study that was done in Barbados, and this was actually done among Seventh-day Adventists in Barbados. And what they found is that the non-vegetarians in this group had a higher odds of being obese compared to the vegetarians. In addition to that, they found that individuals who had been adhering to a vegetarian diet for at least 5 years had a much lower prevalence of obesity in that group, 6.1% compared to about 22% in vegetarians who had been following that diet for less time, and also non-vegetarians. In this particular case, this is a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials where they actually use vegetarian or vegan diets as an intervention for weight loss. And what we see is that for the lacto-ovo-vegetarian diets, they're mixed results. So overall, the reduction was not significant. But there was a significant reduction for weight overall when you look at the vegan diet interventions. And it didn't seem to matter whether or not the intervention included an energy restriction. And partly that's related to the fact that vegetarian diets, and vegan diets especially, tend to be lower in calories than non-vegetarian diets. So even without explicitly asking people to reduce their calorie intake is going to be reduced. And so we see that both types of interventions result in significant weight loss. And then when we take a look at the length of the intervention, both interventions that were less than a year or 1 year or greater had a significant reduction in weight. And this is really important in terms of understanding what types of diets people would adhere to for a long period of time, since adherence is very important for sustaining weight loss long term. And then when we look at studies that included normal weight individuals versus those limited to overweight or obese, we see that in both instances there was a significant reduction in weight. In this particular study, what I like about it is that they actually did interventions of all these different plant-based dietary patterns, basically a spectrum. And what they found in this particular case is after 2 months of an intervention, the vegans and the vegetarians had the most weight loss, significant weight loss. And what they did is several months later, they followed up with these individuals. There wasn't any specific intervention, but they basically followed up to see if they were still adhering to the original recommendations and if they'd had any additional weight loss. And here we can see that the vegans had the most weight loss in this case. In terms of heart disease, what we found is some favorable findings. Then this kind of tracks with what we've seen in the Adventist Health Study. In this meta-analysis of observational studies, we see that individuals with ischemic heart disease had a 25% lower risk for there was a 25% lower risk for ischemic heart disease among individuals who followed a vegetarian diet. Going back to that study that was done in Taiwan, they looked at blood pressure, and among vegans and vegetarians, there were lower odds of them having elevated systolic and diastolic blood pressure. And similarly, they found that for the lipids, vegetarians tended to have lower LDL cholesterol and total cholesterol. However, there weren't significant differences between the dietary groups in terms of triglycerides, and interestingly enough, HDL was actually lower among vegetarians, which is not favorable. But what you'll find is that for anyone who's consuming low amounts of fat or losing weight, the HDL will decrease. But HDL can be increased by increasing physical activity specifically, and also smoking cessation. Looking at this meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials where vegetarian diets were used to see if they could lower lipids, we see that there was a significant reduction in total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, and unfortunately HDL cholesterol, but I mentioned already the reasons for this. And they did not find any significant changes in terms of triglyceride levels among the studies that were looked at for this meta-analysis. So moving on to type 2 diabetes, what we see here is that in the Adventist Health Study, vegans had the lowest odds of having type 2 diabetes, and the lacto-vegetarians and semi-vegetarians were pretty similar. There wasn't a significant less odds for having diabetes among pesco-vegetarians, but definitely the semi and lacto and vegans had a lower odds of having diabetes. When we look at this meta-analysis of various observational studies, we see similar results where the vegans and lacto-ovo-vegetarians had significantly lower odds of having diabetes, and also the semi-vegetarians had lower odds of having diabetes. In this particular meta-analysis of clinical trials, we see that vegetarian diets have been found to actually lower hemoglobin A1C, which is a good indicator of improving blood sugar control, but this did not necessarily translate to a reduction in fasting blood sugar. So why are plant-based diets beneficial? And I'll just go over some of the reasons that could probably explain those benefits. So typically, when you look at the trends in intake among vegans and vegetarians compared to non-vegetarians, plant-based diets tend to be higher in fiber, magnesium, potassium, carbohydrates, whole grains, fruits, vegetables, legumes, and nuts. But these are individuals who are following a healthy plant-based diet, not just eating indiscriminately. And then when you look at what their intake typically is lower in, it includes calories, fat, especially saturated fat, animal protein, and animal protein food products. So one of the things that some researchers have done is to see what the diet quality is of individuals on these plant-based patterns and relate that to health outcomes. In this particular study, among individuals who are not actively dieting, we found that vegetarians actually had a greater healthy eating index score than the non-vegetarians. And this actually is probably even higher because the tool that they used at the time, the Healthy Eating Index 2005, actually penalized vegetarians. It didn't really give them that many points. In a study that was done in Belgium, they found that vegans had the highest healthy eating index scores based on the HEI 2010 index. And we see that vegetarians, pesco-vegetarians, and semi-vegetarians had around the same score, and non-vegetarians had the lowest score. And that was significant across dietary patterns. So there are various beneficial nutrients that help to explain the benefits of plant-based diets for reducing chronic disease. One of these is magnesium, which has been found to inhibit smooth muscle contraction and can be found in nuts, spinach, soy milk, and whole grains. And so this can help with reducing blood pressure. Potassium, we do know, is related to lowering blood pressure, and good sources of potassium include fruits and vegetables. In addition to that, soluble fiber, which comes from whole grains, fruits and vegetables, legumes, and so on, and also nuts. Some of the benefits include satiety, fermentation in the bowel, and that has implications for bowel health and also the type of gut microbiota. It has also been linked to reducing LDL cholesterol, and we've seen evidence that there is a reduction in LDL cholesterol in various studies that I pointed out, and it may also help to improve blood sugar control. And then speaking of fibers, inulin-type fructans have been studied in terms of their impact on the gut microbiota. They're known to increase the beneficial microbiota that are related to having a lower risk of obesity. In addition to that, they've been found to impact the sites of fat cells, the adipocytes, and also increase GPA1, which is a gut hormone, which helps to reduce appetite and increase satiety. And then polyphenols are a class of phytochemicals that have also been found to alter the gut microbiota, and food sources include fruits, vegetables, legumes, chocolate, and coffee. Within the Adventist Health Study population, among non-coffee drinkers, vegans had the highest intake of polyphenols. So right now, one of the hot areas in nutrition research is looking at the impact of diet on the gut microbiome and how that relates to different health outcomes. And basically, fiber, non-digestible polysaccharides, can be fermented in the gut and lead to various changes in metabolism that have implications for health outcomes. So one question is, which microbes are good for health? Microbes associated with excess adiposity include Bacteroides, Firmicutes, and Staphylococcus aureus, and the Staph aureus has been found to be linked to increased inflammation. And then the microbes associated with normal body weight include Bacteroidetes and Bifidobacterium bacterium. But I will say that this research is still in its infancy, and so in some cases you'll find the opposite results in some research studies that have been done. So what we find here is that diet is one of the factors that has an impact on the gut microbiota, and particularly diets that are very high in fat and also low in fiber intake have been known to have an effect on the microbial metabolism and also changes in the composition of the gut microbiota, and that's termed dysbiosis, where there's an increase in harmful bacteria that has been linked to poor health outcomes. And so what we find is that because of these changes in microbial metabolism and composition of the microbiota, we have an increase in fat mass development, glucose intolerance, insulin resistance, inflammation, and so on. And this increases the risk for chronic diseases, including heart disease, cancer, and diabetes. So one of the reasons to explain this is that what they found is that when individuals eat a really high-fat meal, that changes the gut permeability, and that reduces the amount of the healthy bacteria, like the Bifidobacterium, in the gut. And then that has implications in terms of increasing inflammation, oxidative stress, insulin resistance, and so on. And if you're able to improve your gut microbiota profile, then you can increase this GLP-2, which has implications for actually inhibiting these particular deleterious effects that are on this slide. Alternatively, if you're consuming healthy dietary fibers, that has implications in terms of the amount of energy that's absorbed in the gut. They've actually found that it may help to decrease the amount of calories that are absorbed. And so that's going to have implications in terms of weight and other cardiometabolic outcomes. So obviously I've been talking about vegetarian diets, so we'd like to know, well, what is the impact of a vegetarian diet on the gut microbiome? And like I said before, this type of research is in its infancy, so we don't have this fully explained yet. But in this study in Thailand, you see that the vegetarians are represented by the white bar, and you'll notice here that I don't think you can see it on the screen, but where you look close to the top, if I press this green one, The Provotella is significantly higher in the vegetarians, and this is a type of beneficial bacteria. And lower down on the screen, you see that the Bacteroides is significantly higher among the non-vegetarians in this particular group. And that's one of the types of bacteria that's linked to increased risk for obesity. So in this same study, they actually looked at the individual bacteria microbiota composition for each of the subjects, and the vegetarians are on the right side of the screen. And you'll notice the vegetarians don't have any of these bacteria that are at the top, the Bacteroides. And almost everyone had this F. Prosnitzi, which is actually a beneficial bacteria. So it wasn't really that different between the two groups. And then finally, when we look at the interaction between genes and nutrients, there are some actions that take place at the cellular level. One is that macronutrients and micronutrients can have an effect on the PPARs, and this has implications for fat metabolism, insulin resistance, and blood pressure. And also, like I mentioned earlier today, folate is very important for DNA methylation. And besides cancer risk, they've also found that DNA methylation may be related to reducing the risk of diabetes and obesity. So in general, we can say that plant-based diets may have some implications for reducing the risk of chronic diseases. And I don't know if some of you were here earlier, but Loma Linda University is having a vegetarian congress in February of next year. There were some cards at the table outside. If there aren't any more cards, you can check out vegetariannutrition.org if you would like some more information.
Now Dr. Corinne Sinqui Brown will come and give the vote of thanks.
Thank you all very much, and I'd like to start by asking you to applaud yourself for staying the course. I see the crowd growing each and every time towards the end, so it's a good sign. I'd like to first thank our director, Dr. Robin Roberts, who has been a very visionary leader for us. And he has continued what was already staged by Professor Spencer 11 years ago. I have to congratulate the research committee headed by Dr. Raleigh Butler and Dr. Morton Frankson in supporting all the many projects, research projects over the years. What can I say about our conference committee chairperson and the conference committee in general? Dr. Halliday deserves a special, special applause. Not only is he a taskmaster himself, he has worked tirelessly in trying to improve the platform that he started a year ago. I think after he slept about 24 hours, he got up and started working again. This has resulted in an excellent forum for us to share ideas and thoughts. Over 200 online registrants actually registered before the conference, and this allowed us to have sign-in sheets that were prepared ahead of time, and this was a definite improvement over what we've had in the many years. And I'm sure that the total numbers that Dr. Halliday will be able to share with us after his analysis will show an improvement in the numbers of persons who have registered. Honorable Dr. Dwayne Sands and Honorable Jeffrey Lloyd, the Minister of Health and the Minister of Education, respectively, did send in their regards, even though they were unable to attend. I'd like to make a special warm welcome for Dr. Glenn Beneby, who returned to us as our CMO after a long period of absence. And I think this was his public announcement of his return. Let us give him an applause and a welcome. We'd like to thank all our international speakers, Professor Lawrence Sharkin, Professor Denise Eldemar Shearer, Professor Celine Henry, Maisha Hutton, Dr. Robert Kushner, Professor David Simeon, Professor Fitzroy Henry, Dr. Emmanuel Menzo, Dr. Glenn Jones for coming over. I think this is the largest cohort to date, 9 international speakers. And with the addition of our local speakers, we definitely had a good mixture of information and food for thought. Our journey started with a first-time publication workshop that was well received and had over 40 persons attending. Those of us, including myself, who missed it, I'm sure will look forward to having it repeated next year. Our heartfelt gratitude is extended to our international and local speakers for covering such an immense range of topics involving the young to the old, the underweight to the obese, talking about the impact of food that we eat and the effects of lifestyle changes on our health. The 2 days were stuffed with knowledge, but not with food. And in fact, I make special mention of that. You know, I heard some complaints about we didn't feed you. Maybe it's not a bad thing, because when you look at this, weight challenges in the Bahamas, and we are number 6 in the world for obesity. Maybe it wasn't a bad thing, and it actually showed that I don't think any of us died with a slight reduction in the amount that we ate. I'm happy to say that our sandwich size were more than appropriate. Well, next time, Dr. Chin, we'll cut out some of the additional stuff. But yeah, no, we'll cut out some of those. So next time we'll cut back on even more on the thing. And in fact, when you go to international conferences now, you realize that the amount that they're serving you is less and less. Okay? So I think we should mimic that and probably translate this to our own day-to-day eating as well. We heard about the prevention and interventions for treatment and their implications. I was very proud to see our residents being showcased. We did have some of our local lecturers and associate lecturers, Dr. Monroe, Dr. Greg Neal, Dr. Halliday, Dr. Robin Roberts, Christine Parker, and Desiree Cox. But the people who actually came up and were the superstars here were the residents, the ones who put together all of the research projects and presented their information. Thanks to our moderators for trying to keep us in time. Next year we have to tighten that a bit because it's been 2 long days. An extra special mention to our corporate sponsor, RBC, who has in fact been our sponsor from the very beginning. So this is their 11th year of doing this, and hopefully they'll continue. Our support staff, we'd like to make special mention of them because without them, this would not have been possible. So Mr. Micklewhite, Marsha, Tanya, Dee, Sarge, Cheryl, and Shakara. Dr. Conliffe, thank you very much for being the leader for our student ushers, and thank you, student ushers. Our audiovisual team, Gerard, thank you. Ashton, thank you. Okay, and this year, Dr. Roberts actually employed Michelle Carroll to do some of our PR. So a lot of the work and the design you're seeing for T-shirts and for logos and has been her work. So I think that has made us a little extra special touch. Of course, we'd like to thank the School of Nursing here for lending us their auditorium. I'm not sure if this will be enough for next year, but that is something that will have to be considered.